Good afternoon, everybody. A very warm welcome to this ASSAf organized seminar, which is looking at sexual violence among young people in schools. My name is Tamara Schiffer, and I'm at the University of the Western Cape. I am a member of ASSAf, and it's really a pleasure to be here, especially to be able to be facilitating this dialogue with this wonderful panel that we have here today. I will introduce everybody in a minute, but first I'd like to say something about ASSAf, the Academy of Science of South Africa, which is an independent, non-profit organization established in 1996 with a specific mandate to promote and advance science in South Africa. ASSAf serves as the National Academy of Science for the country. It brings together leading scientists and scholars to provide expert advice on scientific matters, but obviously also social and political matters, which are linked to science, and to promote the development of science and research in South Africa, while connected and recognized both nationally and internationally. So ASSAF's role really includes advancing science advisory in priority social issues, secondly, recognizing and celebrating, but also pointing out challenges within our democracy. And thirdly, converging, bringing together various stakeholders to create a platform for dialogue regarding our democracy and its challenges. And this seminar today is one such dialogue. We're focusing here today in the broader area of gender-based violence. Gender-based violence remains widespread in South Africa, notwithstanding what we know is a very progressive legal and constitutional system. These sorts of violences are, of course, entangled with our histories of apartheid, colonization, and male power, what some of us call patriarchy, so that achieving gender and sexual justice for all has a long way to go, unfortunately. So the seminar focuses in on one terrain of gender and sexual injustice, in a particular context, that of schooling. Schools are the very place that we expect young people will feel safe, have bodily integrity, and their rights taken safely and seriously. However, sexual abuse in South African schools remains a serious, widespread, from what we understand, an underreported challenge that, of course, undermines young people's safety, their dignity, and their right to education. Despite existing protocols and policies, cases involving both learners and educators continue to surface. Often we only see the most sensational versions of these, and they reveal the systemic failures in accountability, protection of young people, and support for young people. So this webinar seeks to raise awareness and foster dialogue to prevent sexual abuse in schools by looking at its prevalence, the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of current legal and policy frameworks, and the roles of educators, communities, families, and government sectors. The session will hopefully highlight both best practices for victims, or what some of us call survivors support, but also be directed at strengthening intersectoral collaboration and promoting collective responsibility in creating safe and empowering learning spaces for all young people. So, having said some very few words about the focus to keep to the time, I could say a lot more because I have researched in this area myself. And it is a very prolific and very large area of scholarship, but also policy and practice. But hopefully, we'll get to a lot more of the flesh of these issues once our speakers begin. So I'm going to a very warm welcome to everybody again, but also a very warm welcome to the webinar speakers. Thank you so much for making yourself available. We have some of the top thinkers and scholars in the area of sexuality and gender justice in South Africa, and it's really, really wonderful to have you on this panel today. So I'm going to start in the order in which our scholars will present. And we'll have 20-minute presentations and take discussion and dialogue after all three of our speakers have finished their presentation. So please do take notes as you're listening. Please do keep your comments to each speaker for the last part so that we can dialogue together. Our first speaker today is Prof. Emmanuel Mayeza, who is my dear colleague at the University of the Western Cape. Emmanuel is an associate professor and head of Department of Sociology at UWC. Emmanuel's research, teaching, and publications have for some time been exploring the intersecting topics of gender, sexuality, and violence in and around educational settings in South Africa. And I know he's also worked in many institutions, also closely with Prof. De Vere Barner, who's another one of our panelists today. So he's moved around. We're very happy to have Emmanuel at UWC. Emmanuel's also a C2 NRF scholar, that's no mean feat, and is published in high-ranking international journals as well as local journals in areas of research, including sexualities, gender studies, and sexualities education. Very warm welcome, Prof. Mayeza. Lovely to see you. We were just saying how we sort of miss each other at our campus and meet on these public forums. Then I've got the privilege of introducing Dr. Belita Banda Chitsamatanga, who is at the University of the Fort Hare. Dr. B, which is the way that they are happy to be referred to shorten the long title, is the interim chair under the DSI NRF Saatchi Chair in Sexualities, Genders, and Queer Studies at the University of Fort Hare. Dr. B holds a PhD in gender and policy formulation and a certificate in sexuality studies from the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands, where in fact some of us are there or heading for a conference as we speak. Her academic research intersects with sexualities and genders, women's and children's rights studies in South Africa, and LGBTQ inclusive curricula in higher education. Dr. B is involved in a wide range of projects focusing on the rights of young women and girls in rural settings. She serves also as an executive member of the GBVF Rapid Response Team in the Raymond and Mhlaba Municipality and a committee member of the Forum of the Eastern Cape Department of Social Development, focusing on the state of readiness regarding GBV and femicide. She has worked with organizations such as the Grasa Michel Trust and ENG Foundation and continues to serve in various leadership capacities within and outside academia. So you could see that Dr. B is certainly working both within scholarly spaces, but also in communities and policy spaces. Very warm welcome, and we look forward to hearing you speak, Dr. B. Then Professor De Vere Barner. Well, it's really hard to introduce somebody as eminent as Prof. De Vere Barner. She's currently at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, also a member of ASSAf. In fact, De Vere has been a long time at UKZN. She holds the Saatchi, or what's known as the South African Research Chair in Gender and Childhood Sexuality at UKZN. De Vere's research examines how gender and sexuality come to matter across the young life course, advancing equitable young person affirming approaches to gender, masculinity, sexuality, and education. Prof. Barner is one of the founding members of the Global South Childhood Studies Network. She has served as an advisory member on UNESCO's Sexuality Education Program and was recently a moderator in the G20 session, Education for Gender Equality and Peace, Advancing Gender Transformative Education for All. Prof. Barner is a B1 rated researcher and the 2022 recipient of the HSRC USAF Social Sciences and Humanities Award. She has co-authored 15 books, 5 of which are sole-authored, and over 200 peer-reviewed publications. Colleagues, that's really quite testimony to huge productivity, which I'm deeply aware of as somebody who's worked with Prof. Barner for a very long time. Very warm welcome, and so pleased you could make it in person. Prof. Barner is traveling right now, as I mentioned, and so has prepared a presentation, a recorded presentation, but will be here in the room and available then for questions and comments and discussion. So what a privilege to have such a wonderful panel. I'm looking really forward to hearing everybody speak. And having said that, I'm going to now hand over to Prof. Emmanuel, as our head of university likes to call us. We got the surname. Very good to see you, and over to you, Emmanuel, Prof. Mayesa. Thank you.
Hi, thanks, Prof. Temisha, for those introductory remarks. And I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to meet with you, as well as Devia, as well as Ms. B. So we did have a chat before the start of the webinar, just to catch up a little bit socially. So in terms of my presentation for today, I have titled it Addressing Sexual Violence in Schools through what I call learner-centered and inclusive sexuality education in South African schools. So, so before I get into the details of this proposed tool, if I can call it that, for addressing sexual violence in schools through education, I just want to say briefly about my work in this field over the past 10 years. So I have focused on issues around gender, violence, and sexuality in and around South African schools, different levels of schooling, as well as in higher education. So I've been doing this work for over 10 years. And the specific focus for this webinar around my presentation is around sexual violence among learners in schools. So I'll be reflecting on that, but also, as I said, my main focus is addressing the issue using an educational method, which I have termed an inclusive as well as learner-centered sexuality education program. So this tool, which I'm proposing, focuses more specifically on the prevention of the problem rather than reacting to the issue. So I'll get into details about what I mean by preventing sexual violence in schools between learners through the learner-centered as well as inclusive sexuality education in schools. But I should just highlight those few points briefly. So also, which I think is important as a background to my presentation, is to just reflect on the prevalence, sorry, on the prevalence of the problem of sexual violence between learners in our schools. So, so the problem is widespread, but it is underreported or not reported at all. So not all incidents of sexual violence in schools get to be reported. So therefore, the actual prevalence is unknown and is difficult to determine. So it is difficult to determine because not every victim or survivor officially reports their victimization. So what we have in terms of the statistics and figures around sexual violence really are only cases which have been officially reported, but there's a lot of incidents, there's a huge number of incidents which go unreported, which therefore make the official statistics are not a true reflection of the reality on the ground. So just the one statistic which I managed to find in preparation for this presentation. So I went to the sub-crime statistics for the first quarter of this year. And in terms of the category of crime, in terms of rape in schools as a category, they noted that there were 30 cases which were documented, which involved learners as perpetrators and victims, so violence, sexual violence between learners. And also there were two cases which were reported whereby the teacher or the teachers were the perpetrators and the learners were the victims. So this number, therefore, 32, is both a big number and also a small number. So big in the sense that, schools are supposed to be a safe learning environment. So we want to have zero number in terms of this problem. However, we have 32 as the stats show us. And small in the sense that it does not reflect the true reality of the situation on the ground, given the problem of not reporting incidents of this kind of violence. So the number is small because we know that there are many cases which have not been included in this number. So also on the prevalence of the problem in our schools, we know that our research shows us that female learners are especially vulnerable to being victimized, both by their male learners, but their male peers, as well as by their male teachers. And there are also many consequences of being many consequences of sexual violence in schools, and these consequences are especially more pronounced on the parts of the victims. So victims suffer tremendously as a result, but it is also important to recognize that the consequences affect a huge number of people, including the perpetrators themselves, as well as their families, as well as their relatives as well. So it's not popular to hear people talking about the impact of sexual violence on the perpetrators. But my research, for instance, does show that even the perpetrators themselves, are impacted by the violence that they commit. I mean, they feel the guilt, they get to be expelled from schools, etc., etc. So the consequences are widespread, and everybody is affected by the problem, not just the victims, but the perpetrators as well. So so what is the current educational response to sexual violence in schools? So we have the life orientation, life skills, sexual education for sexual abuse prevention in our schools. So this is one of the currently existing educational approaches to addressing the problem. So what I'm proposing then in this presentation is the reimagining or the rethinking of this educational response. As I said, I've termed my proposal a learner-centered as well as inclusive education. But before I get to that, I just want to say briefly about, yes, the current response, is useful to some extent, but it also has challenges or limitations to it. So one of these is that it is teacher or adult-centered. And what I'm proposing here is the opposite of that, which is a learner-centered approach to how this response is being implemented in schools. So that's one thing. So teachers decide, teachers dominate the approach, teachers make the decision in terms of what topics to discuss around this issue in schools. And I'm proposing the opposite of that, whereby learners feel empowered within the classroom to be able to raise issues and concerns around their experiences around gender and sexuality in the classrooms. So that's just one point I wanted to make. So in terms of what I'm proposing now, the learner-centered and the inclusive approach. So just to break it down a bit, so what is learner-centered and also what do we mean by inclusive in this approach that I'm proposing? So by learner-centered, I mean that, as I said just now, that the approach to sexuality education, which is inclusive and learner-centered, should make learners feel empowered to be able to speak openly and freely about issues of concern to them around gender and sexual violence. So they should be able to see teachers as well as other adults in the school environment as people who are approachable to them, people who will be able to listen to their stories and take them seriously. So the approach is learner-centered in that sense that it addresses, it foregrounds learners' own experiences and views and understandings around sexuality and gender. So it is inclusive as well in the sense that it covers topics which relates to the problem of sexual violence, not only happening in schools, but also outside schools in the communities. So this is very important because we know through research that the violence that we see happening in schools actually is a reflection of what is happening in a broader society. So the proposed learner-centered and inclusive sexuality education approach need to recognize this and address the problem holistically by including both contexts, the school as well as the environment surrounding the school. So in summary then, so the learner-centered and inclusive approach considers and foregrounds diverse learners' lived experiences, understandings, realities, positionalities, and concerns around gender, sexuality, and violence which they experience. So what would be some of the key topics that the learner-centered and inclusive approach need to focus on? Some examples of these topics. So the first is the issue of human rights. So it is important that the educational program start by emphasizing or educating the learners about rights, right? So one of these rights which needs to be emphasized is that everyone has the right to access education in a safe school which is free from violence. So this is important because it will challenge the normalization of violence which we've come to see in our societies as well as in our schools. So first of all, they need to be taught that no one has a right to violate you as a learner. And if you're being violated, you need to be able to report. You need to know the mechanisms that you need to follow in terms of reporting that incident. So here, rights, we are challenging the normalization of violence in schools as well as in communities around schools. The issue of consent is also very important because we know that sexual violence or rape occurs in situations whereby there's lack of consent. I mean, lack of consent is a key key factor when deciding or when assessing whether an incident was rape or sexual violence or not. So they need to be taught about consent and understand, how to express consent to the next person and how to, reject or respond appropriately to unwanted sexual advances. Also important to be discussed is about the difference between healthy as well as unhealthy sexual relationships. So they need to be able to recognize relationships where they feel abused. They need to be able to recognize healthy relationships. And if they feel that they're in an abusive relationship, they need to be empowered to know to to have the information and power and agency to be able to remove themselves from harmful relationships that they may engage or encounter. Also, tolerance as well as acceptance around genders and sexualities. I think it's very important as well because when I spoke about inclusive, the term inclusive, so it means that the education program must recognize the existence of diverse genders and sexualities and the right that these identities have to express their their identities in schools. And this is important also because we know in South Africa as well as in other countries on the continent that young people who express gender and sexuality outside the heteronormative perspective or domain risk being violated in different ways, including sexually. So the issue also here of corrective rape is a serious one, and we need our classrooms to be able to address this issue, to say that everyone has right to express themselves sexually or in terms of gender, and that we have to accept the reality that genders and sexualities are multiple and they are diverse as well. So also address the issue of rape culture and sexual exploitation. I understand that Prof. De Viepana will also be reflecting on the issue of rape culture, which I think is a big problem in our country, and our classrooms need to be able to engage and address this issue. Also address sexual risk, health and pleasures. That's quite important as well. The issue of pleasure is quite a critical one because in the current response, it focuses more on the problems, the issues, risk, diseases, etc. But it is important for the program to also recognize that sexuality is not just about risks, but also their pleasures. So it must be comprehensive, it must be inclusive of both the challenges as well as the pleasures when it comes to relationships and sexuality. Also challenge the stranger danger perception. This is important because oftentimes people think that the potential perpetrator will be a stranger, but that's not true. Perpetrators can be anybody. It can be your friend, it can be your intimate partner, it can be your neighbor, it can be your classmate, your peer, etc. So we need to educate in our classrooms the learners that the perpetrator could be anyone, and even people that we are in intimate relationships with, they can also become perpetrators. They can violate us as well. So the stranger danger perception needs to be challenged in our classrooms. Also, raising awareness, obviously, about the problem, the prevalence, as well as educating the learners about what to do to reduce the risks, and also what steps to follow when one has been victimized in terms of reporting channels. Very important to emphasize prevention rather than reaction. We know that most of our approaches or responses to the problem, is often reactionary in nature, and we need to challenge that and move away from just reacting to an occurrence, but to prevent the occurrence from happening in the first place. So education can play a very important role there in terms of preventing risks of sexual violence, and discuss that with the learners in the classrooms. Encouraging reporting, that's quite obvious, that we need to have accurate data about the problem, because if we have accurate data, statistics, then we can be able to develop appropriate programs as well as action plans, policies, etc., to address the issue. Very important to break the silence around the problem. Support for both victims and perpetrators. That's very important, that once someone has been victimized, they need to know what support is available to them, to help them move from being victims to being survivors. And also perpetrators as well need to be guided in terms of making them realize that what they've done was wrong, and also educate them as well in terms of preventing them from doing the same in the future. So here I wanted to say that the implementation of these topics in our classrooms requires investments in sexuality education curriculum and pedagogical redesign, and appropriate training of the educators. So the learner-centered and inclusive sexuality education program, which I'm proposing here, will not be effective or successful unless we have teachers who are willing to accept this approach and be able to implement it fully within their classroom settings. So the training or the work with the teachers is quite crucial in ensuring that we achieve the learner-centered and inclusive program, which I am proposing here. So, so beyond what the program can do in the classroom, I think it is important to recognize at this point that schools and learner-centered and inclusive education is one of many strategies that could be considered, and no one strategy can work effectively on its own. The problem of violence is a complex issue, and obviously it requires an appropriate response which recognizes its complexity. So therefore, we require a comprehensive approach to address the problem. So schools, the educational response cannot on its own achieve the zero in terms of incidents of sexual violence. However, we need the schools, we need the government, the parents, communities, as well as the criminal justice system, as well as other relevant stakeholders to collaborate and partner and find ways of effectively addressing this complex problem of sexual violence. So my main point here is to say that the schools and educational programs need to be they need to be implemented, yes, but in addition to that, collaboration from other partners and stakeholders is important to ensure that we address the problem effectively. So I end here, and I thank you for your attention. So thanks to you, Prof. Temishofer.
Thanks, Prof. Mageza. Thank you so much for sticking to time, but also for that really comprehensive presentation. And in a way, it's so hopeful to hear the kind of thoughtful ideas about what we can do better, what we can do differently. Hard to get to that point, but it's beautifully outlined. So thank you so much for that. I've also noticed a lot of questions are building up in the message box, but we're keeping those till the end. So don't worry, those of you. We will go on and we'll come back to your questions and carry on posting them. We're keeping track of them. So now I have the honor of introducing or welcoming Dr. B, who is our next speaker, Dr. Belita Banda Chitsamatanga. Over to you for 20 minutes. We look forward to hearing you. Thank you. Dr. B, you need to unmute yourself, please. Yeah, I think you haven't unmuted. Sorry.
Okay, there we go. Thank you so much, Tamara. Let me also take this opportunity to greet Prof. We didn't get a chance to greet before we started, Prof. Divya. And thank you, Emmanuel, for that comprehensive presentation, which actually touches on some of the issues that I'm actually going to be looking at. It is without doubt, colleagues, that in the shadows of our schools, there is a chilling pandemic of violence which unfolds where children, school children, the youths are not just victims, but they are also being exploited and abused in places that are meant for learning. And as what Prof was saying when you were speaking that, and yet we sit with a a watertight, constitution that is praised globally. You'll find that as the levels of GBV rise within the society, so do they within the teaching and learning spaces. And one of the critical questions that we need to ask also is, what has happened to the right to education of the youth? And why do the youth or the learners and the students feel as if they're being silenced, yet there are ongoing horrors of gender-based violence within the teaching and learning spaces? It is at this time that I believe we need to critically examine the environment in which these learners operate, so that at the end of the day, there can be a change of landscape in terms of GBV within our teaching learning spaces, and also in how we can promote our accountability. Raj, maybe can you just go back to the first slide where my topic is, so that at least all of us can be able to align with. Yes, thank you so much. So my name is Belita, as Tamara has already said. Most of the people, they call me Miss B, actually. I'm going to be looking at hashtag Youth Voices Matter in transforming the landscape of school-related gender-based harm and promoting accountability. Without doubt, South Africa remains, GBV or school-related gender-based harm remains pervasive. And it's an issue that, as I've already said, significantly impacts the educational experiences of students, particularly girls, and also the students that identify as queer. Some of us will actually say that belong to the LGBTQ community. So you'll find when we look, we can move to the next slide. You'll find that when we look at the current statistics that we have in South Africa, they are alarming. Maybe before I even go to the current statistics, I just want to borrow on two scholars that I really felt they align with what we are talking about today. One scholar, one of the scholars, they look at what is school violence, and they say it's any intentional behavior that is meant to cause physical or emotional harm. And then if you look at Quirk and Dugat, they talk about school-related gender-based harm being threats of violence based on a person's perceived actual sex, gender, or sexual orientation. So it also touches again on what Prof was saying, that when we look about how best can we be inclusive within the teaching and learning spaces, we also have to look at the violence that students that identify within the LGBTQI community have experienced. What is it that we need to do to go beyond the binary in teaching and learning institutions, so that at the end of the day, there can be transparency in accountability. And at the end of the day, we can also be able to promote the voices of the youth. As I was saying, we've got the statistics that show us that really the situation is bad on the ground. I'll make reference to the first study, which is going to be shown on the next slide. It is a survey that was done in 2003. Rach, can you please move to the next slide? That was done in 2003, the National South African Youth Behavior Survey, and it was giving statistical data of violence in schools. And what we are experiencing today within the schools is not different from what was captured by this survey in 2003. The high levels of bullying, and we also have students that are being forced to have sex, and a majority of students that still highlight that they feel unsafe in these teaching and learning spaces. So you find these figures, they actually underscore the urgency of accountability, and also coming up with effective interventions, but then also in spelling out the agency of accountability. Central to these efforts is the importance of amplifying the voices of the students, of the youth. This is because they play what I would want to call a crucial role in shaping the conversation around school-related gender-based gender-based harm. So if we are going to engage the youth in this dialogue and also in the decision-making processes, one, we are saying we're fostering a sense, we are promoting a sense of ownership and also a sense of accountability. And at the same time, we are empowering them to advocate for change, not only within the schools, but also within the communities, the societies where they are coming from. So in prioritizing the youth perspectives, the lived experiences, the narratives, we are saying it is important that we listen to their voices. What is it that they are saying? How best are they understanding what we are calling school-related gender-based harm? How best are they defining it? And it is when we're able to come up with such, to tap on those narratives, let me say, that at the end of the day, we know the teaching and learning spaces are not only going to be more inclusive, but they are also going to be where learners can be able to thrive and feel free without being discriminated regardless of their sexualities and genders. I want to give also an example. We can move to the next slide, which talks about, I've touched actually on this from past to present. I want to move on the next slide, which talks about the TikTok issue, which I felt this is where actually the voices of the youth of today in South Africa, they've kind of been listened to. If you look at the social media, it is flooded with heartbreaking stories of children facing unimaginable violence. This is reminding us that what we once thought of teaching and learning spaces being safe havens have actually been turned into sites of trauma. And, you know, when I was preparing this presentation, then I was asking myself to say that maybe we should start terming our teaching and learning spaces as institutional betrayal spaces. It's like we have betrayed the youth in what, when they are coming to learn, to say, will be like, this is what is going to happen. This is the school conduct. This is the code of conduct of the school. This is how we are going to protect you. But are we able to do that? And also, if you look even at the justice system itself, hence I keep on repeating to the issue saying that the youth voices matter in changing the landscape of a school-related gender-based violence. We saw how the story of Toto went viral. We saw how the allegations of sexual harassment on social media regarding the teachers and the heads of departments in J.S. Skenjana Senior School also went viral on TikTok. It was only when the youth started talking about these issues, about how they'd been violated, how some of them had even gotten pregnant, that is when action was taken. So this actually gives a question mark about the issue of accountability. Who is supposed to be responsible for these children when they step into the teaching and learning spaces? Is it not the teachers themselves? Is it not also the principal themselves? But then we find, because of lack of accountability and also the voices of the students being silenced, we actually continue to see so many issues of school-related gender-based violence coming up. It is the lack of accountability for these incidents of violence in schools that has actually contributed to some of these issues being highlighted, you know, on social media. You find that when the students believe that their voices are not being heard, or their concerns are not being listened to or addressed, then they will turn into the social media to share their experiences and also to raise awareness. And once they actually do that, it's actually something that is showing a growing frustration among students, responding to the lack of effective responses to violence in schools, and of course the desire for systemic change. So then it goes back again to say that accountability for youth in terms of violence in schools, actually it encompasses a lot of things that we have to look at. Not only are we saying they are amplifying their voices, but also they are calling out for responsibilities of the authorities. We can move to the next slide. They're also calling out for transparent processes because accountability involves implementation of inclusive policies. You know, I always laugh because every time where we meet in spaces and we discuss about these issues, there's always one of the issues that is always raised in presentations to say we are good at putting in place policies and everything, but but the problem is the implementation part. And also the problem is the monitoring and evaluation of those policies to see if we have achieved, the aims and the objectives of what we put on the ground before we implemented them. So when classrooms actually become what I want to call crime scenes and teachers' homes become traps, then there's a need to confront this pandemic of GBV that is ravaging our youth. And how best do we do that? We promote the voices of the students. We promote accountability so that at the end of the day, we're able to dismantle the normative of underreporting of these cases, particularly in schools. So when I was looking at all these issues, then I said to myself, this is actually leading to what we call the SLAP syndrome. This is something that I just came up with when I was preparing this presentation to say there is, when you look at school-related gender-based harm, it impacts severely in terms of, socialization. It has got long-term consequences that Prof was just talking about. It is also the issue of academic impact, absenteeism, poor concentration, death ideation, and all those issues. And so it's got a psychological impact, the trauma, and it also has anxiety, lower self esteem, and then also we've got students that have actually killed themselves in the process. So the fact that we seem to be normalizing this SLAP syndrome in the teaching and learning spaces is actually a call out to say, what is it that we're supposed to do? Isn't there a need for us to reconceptualize the duty of care in schools, which I believe currently is being trivialized? Isn't there a need for us to see how best do we challenge the normative that is there of saying it's okay if you've got damaged peer relationships, it's okay for you to normalize violence, it's okay for you to drop out of school, to have poor concentration. So, but all these things, as I've been saying, is that there's a need to shift the narrative, a need to shift the mindset of saying, how do we change the landscape of school-related gender-based harm in schools? But then it can only be when we tap into the voices of the students. We include them in these inclusive policies that we're talking about. We include them in the implementation of the policies. We can move to the next slide. We include them again into some of the interventions that we believe they need to be taken, that they need to be implemented. And how best do we do that? Prof was just talking about inclusive education. And for us to have inclusive education, it means that in our teaching and learning spaces, there's a need for us to adopt what I want to call the W and the H framework in fighting school-related gender-based violence. The definition for gender-based violence or school-related gender-based harm. Do students understand what's the definition? What does GBV mean? I'll give an example. We've got a group here at the University of Fort Hare called the Queer Ambassadors and the Allies. So you find that normally when we go and do these guest lectures or when you have our workshops and presentations, you find that even at university level, we still have students that still struggle with the acronym LGBTQI, what it stands for. So I believe that as long as the students themselves or the learners do not understand what is GBV, what does GBV constitute, what is school-related gender-based harm, and what are the current statistics, then it becomes a bit difficult for them, they say maybe to even come out and report about these cases. It becomes difficult even for the teachers to be accountable for what is happening within the classes. It's also important for them to know who are the perpetrators, who are the victims, who are the stakeholders in this whole WHR framework, and the reporting mechanisms. Prof also touched on this to say the reporting mechanisms, the intervention strategies, the community involvement. Who do I report to? Who is my focal point? Who is the person that I feel safe to talk to when I know that I've experienced school-related gender-based harm? I recall a few days ago when I was just listening to one lady who was talking at a certain school, that she was saying that it got to an extent whereby even female teachers would actually prepare a room for the students so that they can actually go and be violated by the male teachers there, because that is something that had already been normalized in that school. So at the end of the day, there is that why question that needs to stay with the students so that they can know what is the impact. Why are we doing this? What is the impact? What are the long-term consequences of, I already said, and also what is the ethical responsibility? So once we are able to do all those things, then at the end of the day, I believe that there can be an understanding, a holistic, or let me say a comprehensive understanding of what school-related gender-based harm is. And it is in these definitions that I believe if we're able to come up with, then we also need to know that what can be experienced as school-related gender-based harm in another context can actually be different. So it's actually good at this point to say that whatever the students come up with within their lived experiences, their lived narratives, we're able now to customize and see how best do we come up with the best interventions that suit the unique needs of a particular school. I think I'll move to the next slide. While we're moving on to the next slide, I want to emphasize on the issue of saying that gender transformative education, I believe, is the key, not only in amplifying the youth voices and changing the landscape of school-related gender-based harm in teaching and learning spaces. It can also help again to combat, such violences. I know already Prof also talked about the issue of saying that awareness and education, knowing the rights, the youth, they have to be taught about their rights to education, their rights to health, their rights to life, their rights, to freedom of speech. All those things they have to be taught. And at the center of this is supposed to be their voices. There's a need also for school-wide, campaigns, the posters, the pledges, and also the social media that I was talking about. And also one of the most critical issues that we need to look at as a way also of promoting accountability and changing the landscape is the issue of consent. In the workshops that we've actually had, you find that most students and learners actually struggle with understanding consent. What is consent? And I always say to them, you have to know that consent is negotiated. The fact that I've allowed you to hug me does not mean to say that I am allowing you to kiss me. And we always have an argument, over that. And also looking again at the issue of power dynamics. Remember, with where we are at Eastern Cape, and it's a well-known fact that it's one of the poorest provinces, in South Africa. Already we are dealing with students that come from disadvantaged backgrounds, and as a result, power dynamics come, into play there. So it is also important that as we promote the gender transformative education and amplifying the voices of the youth, there's a need also to teach them about the power dynamics. When are these power dynamics exercised, and how best should they be able to identify these power dynamics? because you'll find that as long as the issue of consent and power dynamics is not looked at, then it's actually going to be difficult to promote the issue of accountability. It's going to be difficult, again, even for the students to come out, and talk about the issues of school-related gender-based harm. And also the issue of engaging the youth in all their diversity as allies to take lead in youth-led solutions. I've said that this will actually lead to sustainability and ownership and shifting of narratives in terms of the issues of gender-based violence. Take, for instance, we do have with us what we call the gender champions. These are the peers that actually go around in the residencies, teaching, their peers about the issues of GBV, its prevention, teaching them about diversity, teaching them about inclusion. Same applies again with the queer ambassadors. They go about, and their allies, they go about teaching even the other students about what it means to go beyond the binary. We mustn't forget that the youth as clients, it is important that we value their concerns, not only in the programs that are implemented in our spaces and the interventions, but also once we listen to their lived narratives and their voices, it is these conversations that us as practitioners, policymakers, and researchers can actually be well informed to come up with a grounded perspective of what needs to be done. So in closing, I just want to say, today we stand at a very pivotal moment where young people have the power to shape the narrative. So it is important for us that we give them that space to shape that narrative and recognize that their voices are not only important, but they are a driving force in the battle against school-related gender-based harm. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Banda Chisamatanga. I think that was a very passionate plea, and I love that your call for young people's voices, collaborative voices, thinking together, agency also very much echoes the first speaker. And so it's really lovely to have this kind of strand that goes through the different, and we'll talk much more about that. I think there are some questions already related to some of these issues. Thank you so much, and for sticking to the time. Our final speaker is Prof. Devia Bana from University of KwaZulu-Natal, who is somewhere in between South Africa and the Netherlands on the way to a conference. We are going to play the presentation, and then Prof. Bana will be available to answer questions and engage in dialogue afterwards, hopefully. So thanks so much to the first two speakers, and over to you, Prof. Bana. Lovely to have you here.
Good afternoon. My name is Devia Bana. I'm the South African Research Chair in Gender and Childhood Sexuality. Today, my talk reflects on almost 3 decades of research on gender, sexuality, and childhood. And one of the most compelling findings relate to the experiences of gender, sexuality, and its intersection with violence and inequalities. So let me begin. So the title of my presentation is Gender, Sexuality, and Rape Culture in and around South African Schools. So my first statement is that sexual violence is a fundamental violation of children's rights. Why then is this violence so common in South African schools? How does it take shape, and what can we do about it? Begin with Panero, who stated in 2006 in the World Report on Violence Against Children, violence against children is never justifiable, nor is it inevitable. If the underlying causes are identified and addressed, violence against children is entirely preventable. The term that I use in this presentation draws from an established body of scholars working with the term rape culture and the culture of rape. In South African schools, we are dealing with the rape culture. This culture has historical roots. It is deeply embedded in relations of power and abuse, where cultural norms intersect with masculine entitlements, the economic crisis, which place particular schools in particular contexts of this country and particular learners at greater risk. This rape culture includes not just acts of rape, but includes sexual harassment, the policing of girls' bodies, dress, appearance, and where such culture normalizes the subordination of girls and femininity. In order to understand sexual violence, we need to note that all forms of violence is gendered. Sexual violence disproportionately strikes girls, and whilst boys are victims too, not all men and boys are violent either. Where and how does sexual violence show up in and around schools? In this presentation, I focus on three areas: inside the schools, on the way to school, and within the broader school context. Let's focus then on inside the school and across school spaces. There are significant actors within the school context: the teachers, boys, relationships between boys and girls, but also relationships between boys and boys. We must not forget that key administrative staff and other workers form part of the overall school regime, and they may or may not be complicit in the perpetration of violence. Sexual violence in teachers. Whilst reporting is really not adequate in this country, we rely often on newspaper and media reports. So, for instance, in April of this year, it was reported that there were 111 cases that went to the Education Labour Relations Council, and this reflected a 35.4% increase from the 82 cases reported in the previous cycle. What this highlights is the need for stronger enforcement of the law and systemic reforms to protect children in school. Other newspaper reports point to perpetration of sexual violence against 7-year-olds. For instance, the report in March 2025 of a 7-year-old in Bergview College in the Eastern Cape. According to the mother of the victim, the principal denied the assault, trivialized the issue, and this points to school negligence in dealing with sexual violence. Other examples of teachers and perpetration of sexual violence include a recent report in October of this year of a bereaved mother recalling her son's suicide as a 52-year-old former teacher of the school appeared in court on 25 counts of indecent assault and sexual assault of young boys. Inside the school, girls report that they are scared of boys. Girls' fear of boys occur in the broader context of gender relations, but also within heterosexual relationship dynamics, where girls fear coercive sexual activities and, of course, other sexual activities not of their own choice. At this point, I think it's important to focus on the expansive access to digital technologies, including cell phones, that are now available even in schools without a lack of supervision or established protocols in which boys in particular are able to download, access, and show other boys and girls what they call blue movies or porn. Indeed, this is a cause of concern as it incites sexual activities, but also creates a culture of fear. On the way to school, girls reported in my research about being afraid of being alone on the way to school, especially in relation to older men. As you can see from the slide, Letzi reports that she will never walk alone to school because of fear of caste following her. In and around school is also an important area, suggesting a continuum of sexual violence inside school, on the way to and from school, but also within the broad community setting. Sexual violence is perpetrated not just within the neighborhood and girls in particular being rendered vulnerable, but also inside the home, pointing to this one fact, that girls are not safe, whether in or out of school. In the last part of my presentation, I want to focus on what we can do to prevent sexual violence. And I want to begin by illustrating the significance of continuing our research and scaling up research for children, sexualities, and gender. This is especially important in the context of the anti-gender climate and the right-wing attack on gender ideologies. As Reynolds in 217 notes, what children need, what children urgently need, are supportive and safe spaces to express and do something about the gender and sexual injustices they feel and see. But they also need structures, people, and knowledge that can nurture their rights. And we as adults are critical in ensuring safety. In relation to structural inequalities, I wish to reiterate that poverty does not cause violence, but there's a complex relationship between structural disadvantage, power relations, and masculinity. We need to address long-standing issues around race and class inequalities, unemployment, and poverty. Another important area in terms of prevention relates to working with boys. In South Africa, working with men and boys has been an ongoing project for more than 3 decades. And yet the idea that men or that real men are heterosexually driven remains profound. Schools need to address boys not simply as perpetrators of violence, but key in terms of supporting the gender challenge and gender equality. The issue around teachers is complex. South African Council of Educators Act and Employment of Educators Act must work in alignment with each other. So teachers can support the work towards preventing sexual violence, and I'll come to that later. But they are also, as illustrated, perpetrators of such violence. Where teachers are accused of sexual violence, disciplinary proceedings must be efficient. Teachers charged with sexual misconduct must be removed from the school with no contact with learners. Dismissed teachers must be banned from future employment, and all schools must ensure that no prior conviction of sexual violence exists. In relation to comprehensive sexuality education, teachers are key. Here they can support the work towards advancing gender inequalities, but also work towards normalizing the word sex. In fact, comprehensive sexuality education provides a good platform for distinguishing between good sex and bad sex. We also need to train teachers in working with issues around sex and sexuality, especially because these words and these concepts remain taboo and sensitive. Finally, we need justice for learners, and we need to act against sexual abuse. We must believe learners when they report on their experience of sexual violence. We need to protect them, and we need to have a zero tolerance for such violence. We must act immediately. Schools must map out where the hotspots are, and they need to fix weak supervision. They also need to establish clear protocols for reporting sexual abuse. In fact, as I noted, with the advancement of technology, schools need to rework their protocols and include porn, include cell phone technology, and develop clear responsibilities as well as punitive action. There must be a multi-partnership arrangement between the schools, parents, the school governing body, the Department of Education, the district, the community, the South African police services, local clinics, NGOs, and civil societies, as well as community leaders. What this suggests then is that ending sexual violence requires a multi-pronged approach. And finally, we need to make schools safe so that every child can learn. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Prof. Barner, for sticking so closely to time and for that very stretching presentation. I think all three presentations really spoke beautifully together and raised some interconnected issues that we can take forward in the question and answer section. We have 15 minutes for dialogue, and I'm going to start with the three questions that have been posted. And they are posted at, some of them directed towards some of our speakers, but others, I think all speakers can choose whether they'd like to respond or not. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to take all three because I think they do speak to each other, and then ask all our speakers to respond. So if our speakers could maybe put on their cameras in the meantime. The first question, which might have been answered, in fact, by other presentations, is given that sexual violence in schools is underreported and difficult to determine, how might researchers develop more reliable methods for data collection? So that's about how do we make this very, very silenced challenge, abuse, more, how do we measure it as scientists? The second question is, I think, speaks to both Ms. B and Emmanuel's, but also probably Prof. Barnes. How does the DBE adopt the concept of learner-centered approach and integrate it into schools? What needs to be changed in schools? Because I think everybody has emphasized the importance of centering young people, their voices, their resistances. So how does that happen at the larger level, at the Department of Basic Education level, and about integrating it more widely into schools? And then the final question for now, in fact, I see there's a further one, so perhaps we could, and they all relate to ethics, so let's maybe take those two questions and come back to the issues around ethical challenges. May I ask, please, to put up your hand, or whoever would like to respond to one or both of those questions. Please, can you go ahead? Please just, yeah, put up your hand or...
Thanks, Prof. Tamisha. I couldn't see my hands. Apologies for just stepping in. So I just want to respond to the question about the comprehensive sexuality education program and what the Department of Basic Education can do to ensure that it is effective in terms of addressing the issues that we've been discussing in our presentations. So I think that the comprehensive sexuality education program as it stands is good in terms of its intentions on the paper, on the documentation and policy documents. And the challenge that we see is that teachers in many of our schools are unwilling to implement the policy around sexuality education. So I think, as I said in my presentation, more work is needed to train the teachers, to empower the teachers to be able to deliver this comprehensive sexuality education program effectively. So they need to be empowered to be able to do this work as per the policy documentation. So yes, I mean, I think training the teachers, working with them, empowering them with skills and knowledge to be able to address the topics effectively in classrooms would be essential from the DBE perspective.
Thanks so much, Prof. Mayeza. Anybody would like to respond to the question of how we can better report on sexual violence? What was it? The question went, given that it's underreported and difficult to determine, how might researchers develop more reliable methods for data collection? Prof. Barnett?
Tammy, but maybe I can come in. Can you hear me? I think, I mean, our research, and I'm talking for Emmanuel and myself in particular, is really focusing on deep qualitative sort of research. And it is through such research that we have been able to uncover some of the examples of horrific cases of learners narrating experiences of others in particular. But more broadly, I think there needs to be a multi-frame sampling of schools, of clinics, but also online platforms, as I've indicated now, is really important to include. There was a statement made that young people are all over TikTok, illustrating how and the experiences of sexual violence in schools. So I think that is another important way in which we could improve our sampling. But we could also run longitudinal panels to capture maybe delayed disclosure. We could repeat victimization. And so it also requires behavior-specific items rather than simply labels such as rape or assault. And I think that's another important area that we can't just simply say, you know, were you sexually violated? I think that we need to come up with strategies about how best to talk to young people in order to elicit and to work with them in ways that recognize how sensitive this is, recognize age-related issues, but also to build up their confidence, to reduce power relations also, so that they feel confident enough to report such violence. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. And I think that Ms. B also mentioned or shared some examples of online spaces where young people are sharing this. So those, of course, are spaces for data collection as well, as you're saying. So I think it's really important for us to extend the way we see data and where we find the material. But of course, more comprehensive kinds of methodologies are also needed. So we've got a lot of questions. One that I think has actually been answered, but I missed out, was right at the top, is how is sexual violence in educational spaces defined? Does it include harassment, coercion, and digital forms of abuse? And I think that's exactly what Devere was saying. In fact, opened your presentation with the definition, but also is now saying as well that there's diverse, and we also need to be clear to when we speak with young people that we don't just put it in the vague collective term, which doesn't often have much sense. But does anybody want to speak to that question in any more detail about definitions in educational spaces in particular?
Maybe I could just expand further to say that I think it is not wise to have a definition that is not open to newer, changing, transforming understandings of what sexual violence is. I think the definition is really valuable, but we need to also listen to young people themselves to understand how we might expand that definition. For instance, this issue now about digital technology facilitated gender-based violence was not much in the South African scope of schooling and sexual violence, but it certainly needs to enhance, or it certainly needs to be integrated in how we understand sexual violence. And that's just one example. Clearly, sexual violence encompasses a range of forms of violence.
Thank you, which are shifting and changing, as you've said. Yeah, thanks so much. I'm going to go to a set of questions around ethics and just ask them together, and then please can colleagues respond. So the first is, what ethical challenges arise when balancing learners' autonomy, parental authority, and institutional responsibility? That's quite a challenging one. And then relatedly, the SLAP syndrome, and I guess, Ms. B, this speaks specifically to your presentation. It appears to describe normalized violence. How can educators and learners unlearn these embedded behaviors? And how do poverty and inequality intersect with gender-based harm, as referenced in that presentation cited literature? And finally, what ethical responsibilities do researchers and educators have when amplifying youth voices in sensitive topics like GBV? Can I perhaps ask Dr. Banda Chitsan to go first, to maybe take the question around SLAP and any of the others around ethics? Belita, would you mind responding first? Yeah, over to you. You need to unmute yourself, Ms. B. Yeah.
Yes, my apologies, colleagues. I just had to respond to someone by my door in the office there. That's why I switched off my video. I think I'll take the question on ethics. You know, it's a very important question, which we cannot run away from, because remember, at the end of the day, when we are collecting data, like what Prof. Divya was saying, these are actually the complainant. I always prefer to use the word complaint when somebody has been victimized, that they are trusting us with what they are telling us, and how best do we get to protect them when we are sending out that the information. That is where the issues of actually consent come in. Consent is very important. Remember, even when I was doing my presentation, I was also talking about the issue, of course, consent in the other way, but now I'm talking about consenting, collecting data to say, are you consenting that I should take out this information word for word? Do you prefer that I use your real name, or I use a pseudonym or a code name, something like that? And what I've done normally with what I do actually with my research, when I talk to queer students that identify as queer, and also any students that have actually experienced school-related gender-based harm, I always make sure that within the university where I am, I've got counselors on board, the psychologists. So what we do is that we talk before we collect the data, and during the course of collecting data, should you feel you are not comfortable anymore, or you need to debrief or anything, we do that. I also do the debriefing myself, so that at the end of the day, I'm making sure that am I still sticking to the ethics of the study, you know, or not, so that I'm not found wanting. And then the other thing that I do in terms of consent and ethics is that before actually I get to send any of the manuscripts out, I always make it a point that I invite again. That I always do. I also invite the people that will have participated in my study to go through the responses, so that at the end of the day, they are in agreement to say, yes, this is exactly what I said. No, I did not say that. Because as I said, you do not want to be found wanting when your work has been published out there, because whatever that gets to go out, you cannot reverse it, because you know, these days, normally when a publication goes out, within minutes, it has been read by millions, you know, of people. Then it becomes difficult for you to recall that. And then on the issue of the SLAP syndrome, could you please maybe just repeat the question on that?
Yeah, it was just to say that it appears, that syndrome appears to describe normalized violence. So how can educators and learners unlearn these behaviors, which are kind of, you know, almost assumed to be just normal?
One thing that needs to be done, I was actually going to tap on what Prof. Emmanuel said is the issue of resistance to change. That is why we've got this issue of normalizing the issue of rape culture, the culture of rape, and also the SLAP syndrome. To say it's normal for you to go through this. Why do you want to report? It's not the first time that this has happened to you. I've got work that I've done whereby you find female students be like, I wanted to report, but then they told me that, look, even if when you report, you are not the first person that it happens to me too. So it's not going to change at the end of the day. So how best do we address this? I've always found it a bit problematic, I'm sorry to say, that I feel as if when our students go out for teaching practice, they go out for a very short space of time. Remember when Prof. Diva was talking, they talked about the issue of saying they're going to talking about the school, outside the school, and I think they also said within the community. So if you say the length of time that we say you are a teacher, you are practicing to be a teacher, this is the time that you get to spend in the school before you come back. I always believe that there's little time that is spent for a teacher to be molded. If you look at other African countries, when one is training to be a teacher, they've got some of these systems that they call the 3-2-3 system. You spend 3 terms in, and then you spend another 2 terms totally out in the school, and then you come back again to finish your degree program. That way now, when you're coming back into the system, you have been hands-on with what is happening in the school. That theoretical part is come and it's aided with the practical part. So as long as we continue normalizing these things and we do not see any accountability being taken, and we are not changing the manner in which we are teaching what's the word to use? The manner in which we are teaching the future as students that are going to be teachers out there, then the SLAP syndrome is actually going to continue. Thank you.
Thanks so much. In fact, I'm going to end off with a set of questions around teachers. You've mentioned a lot already, Ms. B, about teachers and teacher training. And I think I'm going to ask the other two speakers to say a few words, and then for everybody to just share one last thing they want to leave us with, because we are beginning to get to the end. So these questions relate also to teaching, which has come up very strongly, but also the larger school governance system. How do factors such as gender stereotypes, patriarchy, heteronormativity reinforce rape culture in educational spaces? And is teacher bias influencing this? Also, to what extent are teacher unions, school governing bodies, and provincial departments complicit through silence or bureaucratic inaction? And how can teacher training colleges, and I think this is very much the point that Ms. B was raising here, how can they integrate gender justice education and sexual ethics into pre-service training better? So, yeah, I'm going to ask the speakers to respond to this. In fact, everybody can respond and say one last thing that you'd like to share, and then we'll have to end off. Who would like to begin? Okay, we're back to you, Dr. B, and then we'll hand over to Prof. Mayeza and then to Prof. Barner to have the last word. Thank you. Did you want to go ahead? Yeah? Oh, sorry.
Okay, I'll go. Maybe they're still muted.
Yeah.
Okay, I wanted to say currently our curriculum is not inclusive at all. That is where I think we are getting it wrong. Do we understand what inclusive curriculum means? When we talk about inclusive curriculum, it's not a module that is just supposed to be housed maybe within the Faculty of Education only, or within the social sciences only. It has to cut across all the faculties, because we are looking at students, we are looking at the needs of all students. Let me put it across like that. So as long as our curriculum is not inclusive and it does not talk to the needs of our students, then it becomes very difficult to dismantle the problems that we are currently having. Hence, we tend to normalize this, that normalization of gender-based violence within our schools. So the moment we understand what inclusive curriculum means, what diversity means, what transformation means within the institutions of teaching and learning, then I believe we are going to be able to put a stop to GBV. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Bandachi Samatanga. Can I hand over to Prof. Mayeza to just answer anything related to teacher training, teachers, and any last words you'd like to have?
Yeah, so thanks, Prof. Tamisha, for once again. So I just wanted to say this, which was on my mind around the question of ethics in this kind of work. I mean, Prof. Deviepana will know that there's so much red tape which prevents us from engaging more meaningfully with the young people around issues of gender and sexuality. From our institutional affiliations to the schools, to the Department of Basic Education, I mean, we face so many challenges preventing us from doing this kind of work. So I think if they can give us support in terms of allowing us, easier access, to the schools, to the participants, I think that will be greatly appreciated so that we can be able to build this body of work and obviously raise awareness and as part of the research, and also for us to think about programs that would work in terms of addressing the issues that we are researching. So removing the red tape for me would be an important step in terms of expanding the knowledge on these issues we're discussing here. I'll end there, thanks.
Thank you so much. Over to you, Devia.
I think we're in a very fertile but also a very hostile environment. The fertility in South Africa, unlike many countries north of us, is the focus on gender equality, our focus on justice in this country. And I think we need to step up and increase knowledge about what it means to be a country like South Africa with rights accorded to children and young people, gender and sexual rights. On the other end are the high rates of sexual violence. And so we're sitting with these tensions and how best to manage it. And I believe, though, that there are efforts being made, including the protocol for the management and reporting of sexual abuse, which the Department of Education has developed. And I think that there needs to be much more emphasis on how to deal with it, whilst at the same time, key actors need to feel safe that when they report, that they will not be penalized, whether you're a researcher or whether you're just a teacher, that it is important that you will be protected should you report sexual violence instead of simply ignoring and normalizing such violence. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. And thank you to all of the speakers. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of our session. And I have seen a request from Raj to ask people if they'd like more sessions like this. So please do respond. And a big apologies to those who asked really important questions, but we just didn't get to all your questions. Hopefully, the dialogue will continue. We never stop talking to each other, and I think that's what will make a difference. So a very big thank you to the speakers for making yourself available, even while you were traveling and all over, and it's just been a really wonderful session that spoke so well. Each paper spoke so well to each other. I also want to take the opportunity to thank the ASSAf Secretariat, especially Henriette Wagner, Marvin Sitari, Letabo Kumalo, and Ina Smith. But most important, a big heads up, a big thank you to Rajeshri Raj Mahabir, who has worked with such dedication to get this event off the ground and to ensure excellent speakers and a very smooth organization. Thank you so much, Raj. Thank you to everybody for being here, being in the room, and I hope that we will get a chance to dialogue again. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you so much. Bye.